Thank you, everyone. It's so amazing to see folks turn out for this. I'm going to get us kicked off for our roundtable today on diffusing climate and water disinfo in this wild time that we're living in, right? So, a little bit about the Water Hub. So, we are a communications and digital support for groups working for water justice across the US, from water access and affordability to the climate impacts of what's happening to our water on the legislative front. And we also work with arts and culture workers, digital creators, different tactics. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Jessica Jewell and I am the digital director at the Water Hub. And I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole Lampy, and we have our panelists, Phil and Abby. But first, I will pass it off for folks to do their rounds of intros.
Thank you, Jessica. My name is Nicole Lampy. I am managing director of the Water Hub. I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon on Clackamas and Clatsop lands. And I'm going to be helping to manage the Q&A and chat. Feel free, we're gonna start with some prepared questions for Phil and Abby, but if you have questions already on your mind, or if you wanna follow up on something that the experts share, feel free to drop your questions anytime, and we'll get to them towards that. And then I'll also be dropping in some resources.
Awesome. Phil, Abby?
Hi, thanks. My name is Philip Newell, he, him. I'm the communications co-chair of the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition, a coalition of 50 plus groups all over the world working on information integrity and climate disinformation. I've spent a little over 10 years monitoring, researching, and rebutting climate denial and disinformation, and looking forward to having a fun conversation today.
Hi, everybody. My name is Abbie Richards. I research misinformation and extremism, and I also create educational content about it. So I'm a senior video producer at Media Matters for America, and then I also I create these educational videos that help people understand misinformation and right-wing extremism online. My background is in climate, so I did my bachelor's and my master's both in climate studies, and I specifically focused on the intersection between climate change and conspiratorial thinking. So I'm hoping we can get into that a bit today, too.
Nice. We're very grateful to have you both. Nicole, did you want to share any context excuse me, setting from the Water Hub standpoint?
Sure. Yeah, I just, we're excited to be having this conversation now. It's a conversation that we've been having internally and with partners for quite a while. I think we're seeing a rise of disinformation. We've been seeing a rise of disinformation. I'm interested in Phil and Abby's perspective on this too, for years, for a few reasons. Partly because the news media landscape has changed, right? We've seen a huge loss of local news, as well as eroding trust in local news, as there have been less and less local reporters, and as the news outlets that are out there have merged and increasingly become partisan. And then into that information vacuum, we've seen a real rise of social media websites. More and more Americans across the political spectrum, across age groups, rely on social media sites via their smartphones for information. And as you know, in recent years, and in particular in recent months, a lot of the big social media sites have abandoned all pretense of fact checking, which has really created fertile ground for spreading false information, as well as accidentally spreading information that just doesn't happen to be true, that's misleading. And this happens all the time, but we see big spikes in disinformation during major news moments when everyone's paying attention to the same thing. So that can happen in the wake of a natural or unnatural disaster, like the LA fires are a recent example where there were, of course, all sorts of stories from the right wing and from the Trump administration in particular about, the fires being driven by a little fish called the smelt and the state's efforts to protect it and to make wise use of water. And yeah, often disinformation is spread in an attempt to distract either from from a big issue that that the spreader is opposing action on, or to distract from the human toll and to get us back into the realm of sort of like political baseball. And I'm sure Phil and Abbie have lots more to say about that, but I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Nicole. All right, as your humble facilitator, I'm going to move us forward. So to kick us off, Phil, can you share just a definition of terms of what is misinformation versus disinformation?
Um, sure. So the easiest, my simple working definition is misinformation is wrong, is people being wrong, and like that's okay. People are wrong sometimes. That happens. Disinformation is wrong on purpose, usually for money, sometimes for politics. The difference between politics and money sometimes gets a little hazy. So that's really the key difference. A lot of times people will repeat disinformation rather innocently. They're not, funded by big oil, but they might be hearing the people who are, and without realizing that, without the disclosures and transparency of that's sort of an advertisement, they might repeat it. That doesn't make it like misinformation now because somebody said it innocently. It's still that narrative, that rhetoric. If you're treating it as a unit, sort of that comes from the disinformation world. And it can matter because, again, like people are allowed to be wrong, but being wrong on purpose for money or politics is a very different issue. And, you can try and correct people who are wrong and they will take that correction and be very grateful and move forward and be accurate. And some people will not take that correction well and move forward and be accurate. And that's sort of a different problem.
Absolutely. So, the elephant in the room is why is it so bad right now? How has disinfo um, been raging in this political media and digital environment? What are y'all seeing or your thoughts on that?
Okay, so this is like a big question, and there's obviously going to be like multiple answers. There's a lot of things adding up to why misinformation is so bad right now. I mean, in general, misinformation is bad because we're living through this period of informational chaos where like we've never had access to this much information like at all. And then on top of that, we get our information largely through algorithms that are incentivized to distribute information not based on what's accurate and what's helpful and what creates well-informed, healthy citizens, but what keeps you watching the longest and therefore makes them the most profit because then you can keep consuming ads. So those engagement-driven algorithms, and even to some extent like engagement-driven media more broadly, promotes more sensationalist and oftentimes just like wrong, incorrect content. And then when it comes to like climate, misinformation is also like these misinformers out here have really sophisticated networks of distribution. So like these narratives that they're pushing about like climate change not being real or whatever like distraction, like look over here narrative they're pushing that week, they are reinforced through these systems of distribution. You have like right-wing talk radio, you have Fox News and Newsmax, you've got all these right-wing podcasts, and social media more broadly. And then you run into this problem where right-wing content is outperforming progressive and just generally like factual kind of authoritative content on social media across the board. Then my two other reasons for why climate misinformation is so bad right now is that climate misinformation is bad because climate change is bad. And the more dire the climate catastrophe becomes, the more mechanisms behind the fossil fuel status quo will work to keep that status quo in power. So the increase in the climate catastrophe is leading to a fight from the fossil fuel status quo to maintain its power, which comes through perpetuating lies. And then the fourth is that the worse climate change gets, the more people want to believe climate misinformation because climate change is emotionally absolutely terrifying. And climate disinformation is a much more comforting story for a lot of people than actually accepting the reality of climate change, how big it is, how they feel complicit in it to some extent. Like that's really emotionally overwhelming, which makes, like stories about like conspiracy theories explaining the wildfires, much more appealing.
That covered a lot. I think I would only add that beyond just the digital sort of aspect, one of the reasons the problem's so bad is because we have allowed them to take down the guardrails that used to prevent it from being bad. So we allow, the media fairness sort of regulations to get tossed out the window, the media conglomeration, so that Rupert Murdoch can own Fox News and Fox radio stations and the Wall Street Journal, right? Like those kind of things didn't used to be allowed specifically more or less for this reason. And similar to the Citizens United, like there are a lot of regulations that got rolled back over the last 30, 40, 50 years that have facilitated this sort of rise and the use of disinformation as a tool to avoid political accountability.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like it's just one of those like adding on of just capitalism being the worst and putting us in this position.
Totally. And it also just makes me think about like the long game that the opposition, plays and the amount of investment they've put into a digital ecosystem with folks that they're cultivating as their spokespeople, like, right-wing creators, folks that they're seeding out, big oil, partnering with creators on huge campaigns. I've seen some really disturbing stuff like working with Switchers who like have a huge following on Fortnite and building out whole levels and just really being smart about making their message innocuous and engaging and fun. So I think that's something that they're unfortunately very good at and has made it worse.
Yeah, I've seen I think a big shift and increase in greenwashing advertisements from them. I think a lot of the denial that I see is coming more from like right-wing media, and more from like the social media space. And then when you go look at like the advertising from fossil fuel companies, it's a lot more in the vein of like greenwashing. Look how cool we are. Look how awesome we are. We care about the planet. We care about you. We're fun. We're hip. We have our own shell stations in Twitch streaming spaces. Like,
Totally wild. Totally wild. Um, Gamifying their message is nuts to me. But anyway, and it's why we should challenge ourselves to get more creative with our comms and digital work, right? So maybe we can use it as an invitation and creative challenge. But that said, next, I just wanted to see if, from your different points of view, do you have any tips for how folks can spot mis and disinfo?
I mean, Phil, do you want to jump in? I can go. Okay, I'll go. Yeah, okay. So we've got tips on spotting them. I think my biggest red flag when you are engaging with content is looking for what evokes really strong emotions in you. Because that's what like misinformation, disinformation are going to capitalize on, is going to like make you, have a really intense emotion like rage or even like laughter, ridicule, fear, despair, all of those emotions. When you feel them, I think, they incentivize you to immediate action rather than like sitting with what you just consumed. And if you are incentivized towards that like immediate action through some really strong emotion, that's a really good time to check in and pay attention. And then that's like, you slow down, you check and see what the source is. You can always search the claim on Google and see if anyone is covering it that is a legitimate source. And I think that these are helpful tips, but like the most important thing to know is that we're pretty good at sussing out misinformation when it conflicts with our worldview. So like everybody in here for the most part, like everybody's in the water space, everybody has some degree of understanding about climate change. You guys can probably suss out if somebody's out here being like, climate change is fake. Like you're going to be able to tell. The misinformation that you're going to fall for is going to be misinformation that affirms your worldview and makes you feel like you are right. And so like anytime that you encounter something that evokes those emotions and you want to believe it, that's when you should be the most skeptical and really proceed with caution. Like I think building up that like emotional resilience to like misinformation more broadly is an important step to be able to like tell how you are feeling, and like then even after you fall for something, like it, it's okay. You're allowed to fall for misinformation. We're all going to fall for misinformation. We all do it. And I think a good part of building resilience long term is being able to assess after you fell for misinformation, like why. So something I fell for in the water space during the LA fires was the Resnick billionaires like controlling the water, that misinformation. I absolutely fell for that. And I fell for that. And I know why I fell for it. I fell for it because I have like a generally like pretty anti-billionaire stance. And I saw something that made me angry that was about billionaires. And I was like, wanted to believe it. I wanted it to be true. And it's okay to make those mistakes. That's fine. But I think what's really helpful is after you are wrong, to like sit with the fact that you're wrong, understand why, and that helps you to like learn what your vulnerabilities are.
I mean, I don't know if I've ever been wrong. I mean, simply know everything, and then
You've never been
misinformation
wrong,
is really
Phil.
the spot. Like you
I've
just,
never heard you be wrong once.
the internet has the sum total of all human knowledge. How there's no excuse for being wrong. No, there absolutely is. We're all going to get caught up in things, and a lot of it is, like Abbie just said, like if it triggers that emotion, if it triggers a visceral response, and you want to do something about it, that is a big sign, because that is sort of an indication of something, right? Like it should be relatively rare that that you get sort of emotionally activated, and your nervous system responds like that. And that is when like you take that breath and you're like, wait, where did this come from? And that's usually like the first stop is can I, like, what's the actual primary source of this piece of information? If you're trying to figure out if it's right, if it's true, if it's something you should share, that's the kind of the first go-to, and that can usually tell you a lot, because if you can't find anything else and it's just a random person on a social media site, well then like just make it take it as a random person saying something, because that's all it is. Um, if you then find a newspaper and it's a real newspaper that's been around for a long time and isn't one that just popped up 3 years ago, thanks to an industry donation, and like those kind of things. Does it have multiple reporters? Are they real people and not, AI scripted scraping things? So like that's a lot, though. That's a lot, and that's hard, and that's why I feel like it shouldn't be on us to have to know everything. It should sort of be on these platforms and institutions to re-erect the guardrails that make it so that you don't have to sort of fight for your life every time you read something on your phone. There's a chance maybe it's been through some sort of process, not unlike what newspapers go through to fact check, or sort of basic checks on transparency and disclosures of funding and things like that. So at least an ad is labeled an ad, so that at least you know.
Right. It can feel exhausting to be like, what's the checklist to make sure that this is real? Follow the receipts. Like it's a lot. Totally is.
It is. You shouldn't have to do it. It's like the burden of fact checking every single piece of information that you encounter. Like it's a full-time job. That's why like people have that job now. It's a real thing. But like the average person should not have to have that burden. They have a life to live. They have things to do. But we've been, completely like it's factual accuracy has been completely disregarded in our current climate.
And yet here we are. So unfortunately, we hope, fortunately not so, it is what it is. And so we hope that, this conversation, and we'll also be releasing a little guide to help folks work through this and take some agency back and be resourced with how to, navigate this time. But so Abbie, you talked about this a bit on like a recent example with the Resnicks during the fire. Like I definitely saw that circulated on a lot of folks' stories who I really, follow often, and it is easy to like get, yeah, Are from either of you, are there any other like either remarkable example or recent examples that you've been tracking on, mis or disinfo in this moment that folks should be aware of?
So I like kind of steer clear. I mean, I'm happy to give examples. I think that like a lot of the time during these like crisis moments when a disaster happens, I'll have journalists reach out and be like, "Are these conspiracy theories or is this misinformation like unlike anything you've seen before?" And the thing I want to stress is that it's always the same. It's always the same misinformation time and time and time again. They change out specific little pieces, but like it's always the same bone structure, right? It's always just like a distraction of a story, scapegoating some other thing, pulling the narrative away from climate. Like something I focus on, a lot of my research is on conspiracy theories as like, so I did my master's thesis on this. I talked about conspiracy theories or climate change conspiracy theories on TikTok and looking at how people were increasingly using conspiracy theories to interpret climate events. And, we've seen this recently. We saw this with Hurricanes Helene and Milton this fall, and then we saw it with the wildfires. And the premise around each conspiracy that pops up is a little unique, but the structure is the same. So for the hurricanes, especially with Helene, we saw this narrative that like the hurricanes were created on purpose to wipe out that area. And one of the popular conspiracy theories I saw was that they were wiping out that area so that they could mine it for lithium. Because why not? Like that's the kind of stuff that they come up with. And like that's obviously not true. The hurricanes obviously weren't created on purpose. They are a climate event. But you have this applying of intentionality to it. And that's what that conspiracy is. Now, with the wildfires, you get the same thing, but like the wildfires are started on purpose, or the wildfires were started by direct energy weapons. And it's the exact same structure. It is saying that this is not climate, this was done on purpose. And that like takes the blame away from climate and it gives them a scapegoat because now they don't actually have to address climate change. They just need to find whoever has the weather machines. And then we can clear this all up. So yeah, it's not that like there's specific narratives that are especially interesting and relevant and new. It's the same thing, just changing a little bit of its makeup every single time.
That's really good points. The playbook is the same. They're speaking from the same playbook and just reconforming it to the moment to be opportunistic. That was really helpful. So I guess this, we've had some questions in the chat and it is on our list to discuss, but do you have any like practical tips on how to prepare, you know, either pre pre-media moment, during a flare-up, and after, from pre-bunking to ongoing year-round work that folks should be doing to help seed out, correct narratives so that when those, moments come up, people have a little bit more resources to understand that this might be false facts that they're looking at?
I can suggest, and we'll drop the link here. The debunking handbook has been around for a while. It is scientifically tested and retested and updated, and that's really my go-to. Specifically in there, they talk about the sort of debunking structure of being fact, myth, fallacy, fact. Which is also sort of a truth sandwich of in that first and foremost, like you wanna reinforce the facts and the truth and the reality, because we know like that's what the most amount of people are going to see. More people are going to just see the headline than are going to read all the way to the bottom, right? So if they're just going to see the headline, you want that headline to be the takeaway thing to remember, not are you wondering about some wacky myth? Like that's a good SEO. That's search engine optimized headline. But that for the people who just see the headline, they're not learning anything. You do want to reference, of course, some of those key SEO terms within it, but you minimize the myth when you're presenting it, in order so that, like, in the same way, if you had a radioactive material, you wouldn't, toss the plutonium to your buddy. You put it in a lead case and have big gloves, and it'd be treated like something that's toxic and dangerous, right? That's sort of how you would want to treat the disinfo narratives. They're dangerous. You need to warn people about them, and you need to sort of get into the conversation when people are looking for them. But you lead with that headline, the facts, the reality. You reinforce the case. Then you can then you mention, okay, but some people might be out to mislead you. You might hear some wacky things. Social media is awash in crazy conspiracies. So look out for, and that's where you mention the kind of specific myth that you're trying to address. The next part is where you unpack the fallacies, and key here is giving people basically a better story than the story that the disinfo tells. So like Abbie was saying, like those distraction that like, oh, really, it was a controlled weapon, like that's a really fun, interesting story that sticks in your mind really easily. You have to replace it with something that's also fun and entertaining to an extent, and a lot of times that means, oh well, there's actually a villain in the story, and it's the person who just lied to you. If you can't do that, if you can't make the financial links and be like, oh well, this person works for the industry, that's why they're saying that, which is true for a lot of the times. You can also sort of dissect the fallacies of how did they make this argument that's not true, and here's how they represented somebody who's not an expert as though they were an expert, or here's how they set an unreasonably high standard of an expectation for a policy of like it's got to be perfect or nothing, or whatever it is that you as sort of an expert on the issue would be able to see pretty clearly. You can unpack that a little bit for them, not like the whole back and forth. They say A, well, really we say B, and they say C, so really like that kind of back and forth sort of takes it too seriously. Because again, like it's a lot of nonsense, and it's a lot of stuff that you can run yourself ragged if you try and get every little point. Whereas you kind of take the big picture, you give people that story so that they don't have to get into that back and forth, because people don't want to do homework. Like that's not what they want. They just want to know if they can trust this. And if you say like, oh no, this person's got a whole history of lying about this, or if you say, here's how they cherry picked, and like really they chose 3 years, and here's what the 10-year graph looks like, and it's a totally different story. Those kind of easy examples help people raise their critical thinking skills and recognize there's those things, and maybe they'll be a little slower to reshare it next time. And then again, you close it with that fact. So the last thing people see, what they did make it all the way through, is a reiteration of your basic facts that climate change is real, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the real structure of it that you can apply sort of up and down the scale of an op-ed can take that basic structure, a speech you give, a social media post, an answer in person, like that sort of fact, myth, fallacy, fact is just kind of engraved in my brain at this point.
Yeah, I mean, jumping off of that, because that structure is also a huge part of like when I make a educational video debunking something. I'll try to stick to that structure as best as I can while still making it interesting and fun. Um, and yeah, so as far as like, before, during, and after these crucial media moments, I think, debunking, like Phil just said, obviously important, very helpful. Pre-bunking is something that I would suggest doing, all the time, and like before events especially, but like just teaching people in general how to recognize this. So pre-bunking is like you debunk the claim beforehand, but instead of just focusing on the claim itself and like this one specific claim that you need to debunk, you focus on the manipulation tactic. So you tell people like, hey, like people out there are going to try and manipulate you, and this is how they're going to do it. And they might do that with like this, like you'll give them an example of something that they could look for, like an example of a way that they might be manipulated after you've warned them that this is manipulative content. And then you explain how it emotionally and like psychologically manipulates them. And that just like teaches them not just one claim and how to tell that it's wrong, but in general, how to recognize when they are being manipulated. And that's like education that needs to be happening constantly. And I think that's a big component of that like before and after these events to build resiliency. Other things that I would say for like building, you know, resilience to disinformation during these media moments are establishing trusted messengers within your community. And these are like people or institutions that are trusted by your community. And that could be anything from like newsletters that they read to like local organizations. You guys, as the organizations that you are, might be trusted messengers, local media outlets, influencers and content creators, faith leaders. Those are all like really good trusted messengers to speak to people during these times when they are uncertain about what's happening. And then also long-term building not just media literacy, but going beyond media literacy and into kind of more of an ecological literacy so that like people understand these structural problems that are part of the reasons why they're being manipulated. I think, you know, media literacy is great. It's really helpful. It's a good like first like stepping stone. But you know, all of our problems are really connected. So if they can kind of understand a little bit more about the profit motives and the political motives behind, you know, why they're being manipulated by content that they see, I think that that helps to train them to be more resilient and train them to expect to encounter misinformation, especially during those big events. Then during events, I think, you know, debunk what you can. It's also not your job to debunk every single thing you see. They will waste your time that way. That is the strategy. They want to flood you and put you in a position where you have to debunk every single claim. Like think about like how FEMA has been under just like the most attacks ever, like during the hurricanes, and like FEMA had to create like a web page just to debunk all of these myths. And that's a really effective way of stopping us from doing our work, is that they flood us with things that we just need to like correct. So there's times to debunk and there's times to bypass. And sometimes when you're confronted with you know, a piece of misinformation, the best course of action is not to engage directly head on in an argument, but instead to go with just right past it and back into your initial message about like why this is climate related, or like why, you know, the bigger message that you have that isn't about this like specific distracting piece of misinformation. So you don't have to debunk everything. You can also sometimes just jump over it, and that's okay too. Yeah, and then I guess as an ongoing measure, more climate communication, more like people don't have that much climate literacy in general, so they lean on misinformation during climate events to try and interpret what's happening. And that's partially, you know, it's because they are being misinformed, but it's also partially because they don't have the climate education in the first place to understand what's happening. So more climate communication and literacy in general.
Completely. Love this. I also was in a talk recently that was a panel of creators that was organized by High Country News that was really interesting. And one of them said, I liked the comparison of that your comment section is your garden to tend, and that if you're not being attentive with your community management, you can unintentionally have disinfo and misinfo going wild in your content in the comments. So they recommended, if you have the capacity, to try to set the record straight with some, because you don't know who's going to come through your content later looking at the comments and getting swayed, you know, maybe the wrong way. But if you don't have the capacity or time and it's really getting wild in there and hairy, to just turn the comments off. I'm curious if you agree with that, Abbie.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I post something, I typically take the first, you know, few hours and I do pay a lot more attention to comments, because those are the comments that will set the tone for the comment section going forward, because that will be like the things that people see. Those will likely be the things that have the most likes. They'll be at the top of the comment section. So you have power in that moment to like choose what to engage with. So like engage with people who are good faith. If you know, sometimes I miss something in my video and I don't speak to something in completion in the way that in hindsight I wish I had, that's also a good time to kind of clarify that early on so people can go find it in the comment sections. Yeah, and I think also a lot of the time, I find at least, people who find my content pretty early tend to be better faith, uh, because they're following me. It hasn't gotten, like, into the algorithm yet, so it's a good time to also engage with some of the people who, like, if they're interacting with your content really early, they probably have a reason to do that, and that's, like, community that's worth, maintaining a relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Completely. Just want to validate, I'm sorry if I'm going to get your name wrong, Larisa, that yes, when appropriate, please, people, find some levity and humor and opportunities to make content engaging. It's okay if it's entertaining when appropriate. You're going to reach more people than being stodgy and really inaccessible and boring. Let's be real. So, of course, respectfully, but when appropriate, by all means, test different formats and tone.
Well, and don't be afraid to say what you do know before we know all the details of the situation. So, like, part of the reason why the disinfo and the clout chasers sort of always win is because as soon as something happens and they see that sort of trending on the algorithm, boom, then they're there to push their priorities. And clearly they're doing it in an ethical manner. There are ways to do it ethically of engaging with what you do know, and in that way there isn't a vacuum of information, and the only things being talked about, like the only people saying anything, are the people who have an agenda. You can make some space to say we don't know yet and be cautious of anybody pushing an agenda right now. That's at least something that officials can say before sort of all the facts are in, because that's the problem. Facts take time to come in, and if you're a career liar, you don't wait for the facts. That's actually exactly the time you want to send all your pitches to media and seed the social media space and otherwise spread your message, because you get that kind of first mover advantage. So for the sort of official bodies, saying something real quick, establishing some lines of communication for reporters so that you can at least say, hey, before you run anything, check with us if it's about something official, if it's about sort of water being withheld in a moment of crisis, maybe check with the agency that would be doing the withholding before you run with that. Obviously people who don't want to be right are not going to do that, but there are ways you can address it. I think speaking to some of the comments about saying things specifically and whether or not to address the disinfo and the lies themselves, I think it could sort of depends again on that line between mis and disinfo, because if somebody is pushing it professionally, they're not going to go away. You sort of have to address it, right? Like, you're not going to give it additional oxygen by talking about it when somebody's whole job is to harass you about it. At the same time, I know you don't want to be putting on government websites like, here's why our political opposition is all wrong and liars. I think some of the way that people have found to address some of that in a more neutral tone is just the FAQ section. And then it is that FAQ can speak to those myths. It can use some of the exact terminology and some of the questions so that it does come up when people are searching, hey, what's the deal with that? But format it in a way that as you're scrolling the page, just kind of perusing, you don't see a big, bold lie, and you see the truth in the headline, and then sort of you have to look for what the lie is, because when Google spiders are crawling your page, they don't know the difference between a small font size and a big bold font size. The word shows up, and so kind of keep that in mind of minimizing the myth to the extent possible while still acknowledging it so that people looking for accuracy can find that information. It's sort of a judgment call every time in how much, but you want to give primacy to the facts and repeat sort of as little as possible while still addressing it. Otherwise, you might look kind of goofy if you're just saying things without any sort of relevance or context.
On the note too of like using humor, I think that like a lot of the time, especially in like the nonprofit world and the academic world, it's easy to get caught up on like accuracy and legitimacy and like being an authoritative source. And I think that like a lot of the time we get out competed in the world of vibes. And like we're allowed to make content too that is like just vibe based, and like that like part of climate communications in general should also be about like portraying a certain energy that makes people excited about it. It doesn't need to just be like facts and like here's this like thing about the climate crisis. Like you can also just like make content. Like if you're fed up with misinformation, make an edit that's like a powerful like collage of the oceans and how cool they are. Like that's also a super valid response, is to respond to all this negativity that like completely dismisses the oceans and how important it is with just like vibes about how great the oceans are. Like you can also respond that way, and I think that that's often missed when we're just like too deep in the academic side of it.
Yeah, nobody wants to go online and do homework. And that's what a lot of professional NGOs and other like smart people do, because well, smart people did kind of like doing homework, and we do like learning new things, and it's fun to learn new things. And like no, most people like, and when I'm scrolling social media, I'm not trying to learn. Like I'm trying to see, you know, some cute pictures of a sloth and, you know, something funny to make me laugh. And so that sort of perennial question of like how do we do well on social media is part of it. You have to recognize it's social media. Like you have to relax. You can't be a stodgy brand because nobody likes a stodgy brand. And if you're not comfortable doing that, then like maybe you don't have to be on social media. And that's sort of my other big picture advice is like let's make social media not real life anymore again. Um, like let's make it a place where it's fun stuff, and do your real world organizing in the real world in your local community where you can walk outside and talk to a neighbor, as opposed to like shouting into the void on your phone. Like that sort of how can we reconnect in the local context, outside of these platforms that are often, if not always, controlled by people whose interests are fundamentally opposed to the general public's well-being.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just touch on that just to put a fine point. Like, for example, the Water Hub, we've been trying to experiment more with like strategic use of memes. And like when there was news around the Air Force not wanting to clean up some PFAS in Arizona, we just did like a little meme drop that was, you know, played a little bit with like being tongue in cheek, and it ended up performing really well while still educating people like, oh, maybe this is a bad thing that folks don't like. Why wouldn't they want to clean up these toxic chemicals? Like, so there are ways to test things out and agree, and just thinking about leaning into like your other community spaces, like you said, IRL, real life organizing, building your newsletter list, like speaking to people directly who want to hear from you, is really vital. So anyway, I will move us along because I do want to give space for Q&A, but just, you know, given the dumpster fire that we live in, just, you know, this hellscape, how do you both stay sane or hopeful? Do you have any kind of tools with like the toll this can take emotionally on y'all?
I can go. Yeah, I have a bunch of tools. I mean, like, I've been doing this for several years now, and like the first few years, I definitely didn't have tools, and it took a toll on my body. Now I'm a lot better at it, and like, there's a lot of dance breaks that happen after I do. I actually just posted a video about how I did dance breaks after publishing a bunch of research into Candace Owens's recent anti-trans tirade. So if you go look at my social media, you'll see me dancing to Disney Channel original musical songs, and it slaps. But I think more broadly, with this conversation of like how to stay hopeful, I think that this might be kind of a hot take, but I don't try to. I don't think that it's, like, super helpful, to be honest. I think, like, hope and despair are both just emotions, and, like, any emotion, like, they come and they go, and, like, they're not permanent, and I don't think that, like, hope is a great motivator for action. Like, I don't take action because I hope it'll work. I take action because I believe that it is the right thing to do, and I feel motivated out of, like, an obligation to try and improve the world and do it for everybody else who's here and all these other species that are here. Like, that's why I take action. Um and I think that, like, a lot of the time, like, we overfocus on hope and the future, and, like, I also want to encourage people and, like, let them know that, like, it's okay to grieve. Like, there's a lot of complex emotions in this, and like you are complex and able to like you contain multitudes and you can hold multiple different feelings at once. So like we must, you know, confront our climate grief and like grieve the loss of species and grieve the melting ice caps and grieve the collective insanity of not addressing it. Like all of that is very real grief that like I think it's actually liberating to let yourself feel, whereas it's kind of confining to try and deny it. So I do encourage people to kind of let those emotions run through you. And then use that grief to connect with other people and like find other people who are doing fantastic work too, who are also acting because they believe it's right. And like they will give you the hope again. Like they connect you in. Like when you're in community, I think that's kind of what spurs those feelings of hope. But yeah, I mean, I recommend instead like trying to focus on finding like tremendous joy in the present, not just trying to like hope for success in the future, but think about like all the wins that you have in the present, try and dance, form community, laugh, make art, enjoy art, like look in awe of the world and how wonderful it is, and think about that, and don't get like lost in what could be in the future.
Which is a very lovely and emotionally intelligent answer, to which I will counter, anger and spite are also wonderful motivators. I mean, if it works for you personally anyway. No, more seriously, I think compartmentalization is the psychological word for it. When I'm working, when I am sort of monitoring right-wing noise machine disinfo spaces, I'm not using my full screen. It's not giving my full attention. Not to toot my horn, I'm a little bit intelligent, and disinfo is incredibly stupid. And it doesn't deserve my full attention, no, nor does it deserve yours. So it gets like a little panel of my screen, like my email is on a big half of it, and like where my Slack, where I'm talking to people. And then like my browsing window, like the Twitter thread will be very small, and like a video I watch of it will be like, you know, a tiny little inch thumbnail basically. And then I have a whole nother computer over here, which is just like my calendar and my music that I have playing at all times, and maybe a live stream from explore.org of some bears fishing in a river when it's the fall season, or the sloth live stream, or something else to sort of quite literally balance the emotional kick of fight or flight when you see something terrible and you want to hit it, or you see someone who's just a liar who like you want to make a liar stop lying. Again, that's that visceral reaction, and it's a negative one. Having the other external stimuli that are more positive and relax and trigger the parasympathetic nervous system to then calm you back down can be really helpful. So like touching grass is sort of how you stay sane in a very literal sense. Green and blue colors and natural scenery can quite literally slow your stress response, according to at least one study that I'm counting as real.
I
I like
love
that
both of
you're
these.
you're overstimulating yourself into a sense of calm.
Also, like toys, stress relief, stress balls, things you can throw, just yeah.
Yeah, I think so for me, just like random things I use. Singing, like singing or like chanting, like I'll do like Om chanting, and it relaxes, I think, your vagus nerve. And that can be really good for you. I definitely recommend meditating. I definitely recommend like focusing on being in your body several times a day, like waking up and like before you engage with the news or anything, like do something like stretch a little bit, like do something that brings you into your body. Again, the dance breaks, I cannot recommend them more highly. I love them. Cuddling with animals, great. Cuddling with people, great. Um, baths, I love. I don't use stress balls, but I do like a fidget toy.
Amazing. Okay, quick. Do you have any must follows or resources, or, Phil, you've even said if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, where do we go for both monitoring or resources and support?
The CAD Coalition, Climate Action Against Disinfo. We do monitoring. We write briefs. We occasionally get to meet with social media companies, very earnest staffers before they get fired and replaced by other people a few months later, et cetera, years and years in a row, doing some of basically that tech advocacy to try and level the playing field, because social media is not an unbiased level playing field. It's by and large owned and operated for right-wing politics at this point. And so that's generally, in my advice is engage as you would, as it were, Truth Social, because that's kind of what most of them are. Find the spaces you can where you can build something better that isn't going to be easily bought or co-opted. But I don't have good answers for that. No, I don't know your neighbors. Go make friends with real neighbors. Oh, see, there's the good list. Thank you, Ad.
This is like not even remotely comprehensive, but like just like what I could come up with last minute of just like some people who I really like. And like these are all Instagram handles for them. And they all do different types of climate communication if you're looking for like content creators in that realm. I also love CAD. I'm in CAD, highly recommend CAD. At Media Matters, we have a climate team. So if you're looking for more like in-depth like research into specific narratives on like climate misinformation or how climate is being covered by news outlets more broadly, that's like really helpful research that Media Matters has, that our climate team does. And then I really like Climate Power for climate comms. I think they have a really good newsletter too, where they just like put out helpful information on climate communications.
Amazing. So, yeah, we only have a couple minutes. This was a really robust conversation. If we have some time to go into some Q&A with the time that we have left, I'd love to move us into this. It's a little adjacent, but curious if y'all have thoughts on if progressive or, climate, advocates should actively be going on, maybe adversarial feeling outlets, as like, how, Bernie went on Joe Rogan, I'm pretty sure. How do you folks have like opinions about that?
It's a debate that's been going on for a really long time. I mean, it's been going on since like they were having this debate with talk radio too. And it's not something that I think anyone has a great answer to, because there's pros and cons. Like on one hand, you're giving them not just like your audience because you're coming on there, but they also a lot of the time have editorial control. So they if it is a situation where they have full editorial control and they can just edit you to make you look dumb and wrong, don't do that. If you're going on a place that like you could have some editorial control, that's like a slightly different conversation. I think it also depends who you are. So like progressive white dudes, like I'm more encouraging of them going on that space than I would like tell like a trans person of color to go on that space. Like I think that there's levels to identity of like when it becomes safe for you to do that. But yeah, I mean it's a conversation that I know that people in my sphere are definitely having, and I don't have like I don't have a great answer. I'm sorry.
I think as long as you sort of know what you're getting into, and people have talked about like Pete Buttigieg being great on Fox News, and when you watch that one clip that he's in, yes, he does very well. And I think it was somebody at Media Matters actually that pointed this out. But when you watch the rest of Fox News for the day, all the rest of the audience sees is Pete Buttigieg's worst moment cut up the worst possible way, to make him look bad. So like, is that a net win? I genuinely don't know. I think my bigger answer is that you should try and spend at least as much time trying to reach audiences who don't have a political identity as you are trying to change the political identity of your opposition, of the people who like hate you, of like if I'm a FEMA person, and obviously I'm not, and my options are like make people who don't hate me like FEMA, or make people who just try to hunt me when I go try to save them from this natural disaster like me. I'm going to go with the easier, bigger audience of not trying to change people's mind, but just trying to engage new audiences and bring new people into it and help new people like engage in a way that we hadn't thought of before versus trying to change what is a very locked and deliberate political propaganda sort of machinery. My vote is we just sort of limit the propaganda machinery altogether, but that is a much larger question.
Totally. Yeah. In a previous life, I was at an organization that would actively seek out opportunities to get live interviews on Fox News and stuff to just incept the message. And that the people who were media trained to do that were extremely tough and knew what they were getting into. And they did get lampooned quite a bit. But I think that for them at this organization, they felt that it was worth it. Even though it was quite the lion's den, it's not for everybody or for every organization.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it because I cry very easily. And I know that they would love to make me cry. So like I'm not putting myself there.
Well, and I might, but then they're not going to invite me back. And that's the kind of thing. Like if you perform well within your values and for your community, then they're not going to invite you back, and it's a one-time thing. And then I guess I see the question from the government agencies when government agencies are not trusted. That is a tough nut to crack. That's part of why the propaganda and disinformation machine has attacked and undermined scientists as well as governments. Like working with influencers is a way to do that. That is at least one way. Like, you know, government can use paid media. Like you can place ads that can be effective. That like an ad for the FAQ doesn't necessarily have to say someone's lying to you. It can still get like you can push the ad at somebody who is watching, you know, the bad news. So like you do have to sort of work with the community just in a different way and like use the other trusted messengers along with yourself to try and say like, oh, you trust this person, like they trust us. Let's build that community and that trust together again. Is I think, you know, the best I can offer anyway. Hope that helps.
Great advice. Diversifying the messenger is so real. It's like do or die at this point, honestly, and to really challenge yourself to dig into new strategies and ways of doing this comms and digital work. It's not the same, you know, for better and worse. So that was great advice. I want to recognize that we're a little bit past time. I don't know, Abby and Phil, if you need to bounce or if there are additional questions that we can take.
I'm good for a little bit.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I guess actually while everyone is here, please, I beseech our attendees, if you're still here, please fill out this survey that I just dropped in the chat. It'll really help us be better and bring more trainings that are relevant and just tell us what we're doing right, what we could do better. By all means, please fill that out before you leave or right after. But yeah, I'm gonna check the chat to see if there's anything else.
One question that we got, Jessica, from Maritza is about stories that have a lot of quotes and whether there are laws against misquoting people.
If there are, they are not well enforced because yes, that is a tried and true tactic for disinformation. You cherry pick a quote because yeah, a lot of times in like an academic paper, it will be a whole paragraph about how 1+1=2, and there will be a sentence of like, oh, except under some very rare circumstances with fancy math, 1+1 can equal 3, but that's only with, you know, theoretical whatever. That's of course what they pull out. Like, haha, this says 1+1=3. Isn't that crazy? And of course that does sound crazy. And then you have to actually click through and go read the whole thing. So yeah, sometimes a lot of quotes is just like somebody cobbling stuff together. Sometimes very specific quotes when it's like, oh, would a big scientific body really say that, you know, you can't trust science? Probably not. Then you have to sort of go see where that quote came from. And usually it's pretty quick. You find that quote and the rest of the paragraph says the opposite of that quote, for example. in the real time stuff at this point with generative AI, we are getting the point where I guess you could make up a whole story with fake quotes. I don't see a whole ton of that yet, but I don't know that it's far off.
We also had a question about sort of the value of remaining on social sites that have poor policies around managing disinformation. Like, on one hand, we want to act in alignment with our values, and on the other hand, are we just abandoning those places to become petri dishes of mis and disinformation? Like, what's the calculus there? The question was specifically about government agencies, but I'm sure a lot of nonprofit organizations are facing the same dilemma.
I mean, it's really complicated. It's definitely something I think a lot of us have struggled with. It's not just that I'm concerned about them becoming like right wing, just like disinfo petri dishes. I'm concerned about us like dismantling our own communications infrastructure out of an ethic. Like, I wouldn't stay on to like fight the good fight and make sure that the platforms like stays as good as possible. I'd stay on like if it is useful to you and you are able to reach an audience, and like if that's your motivation, I would recommend, not dismantling your communications infrastructure, especially right now when like there's a lot of hostile actions being taken against organizations like us. So I get the motivation for it. I really do. I feel it. And it sucks to know that like you posting on there makes those companies money. But also that is the infrastructure that we have, and we should not opt out of our infrastructure and our communications with our audience, I think.
Yeah, if you have a big audience of good people, if you have built political power on a platform, by all means, keep it. I think what, specifically what has happened is very clearly they have turned up the dial on the right-wing voices and turned down the engagement for left-wing and progressive politics, and really anyone in the reality-based community. The engagement has, I think, over the past couple of years really dropped there. And so it is each organization is going to be different, but I also think writ large, build things you can control, build platforms you do control, build places that you can, an email list that you send emails out to as a government agency might be more effective than Twitter at this point. And I think stay clear-eyed about how big Twitter was. It was never a majority of people on it. It was never that big. Its value was always in, to be kind, we'll say, rushed reporters just pulling quotes from Twitter that happened to fit whatever spot. Like, it was a way for media to pretend like it was the whole country and treat it like it was, and as a sort of central point for our culture. But it was always a relatively small portion of the actual public versus what you would expect on sort of a TV broadcast or like an emergency alert on your phone. If you're a government agency, maybe that emergency alert is the way you go instead of posting on Twitter. Any more than you would have posted on 4chan or Rumble or Stormfront or any other number of right-wing spaces with objectionable and offensive and otherwise harmful content circulates. You wouldn't. People don't. I don't know if government officials post on like local Reddits, but subreddits are an option you could use, and at least for a while, I think Reddit had more users than Twitter. So like that's an option. I used that for a while, and that's a place where, to get back to the sort of the comments, I replied to my comments who were critical on Reddit, and I let them know what was up. And I made an example of them for everyone else, and it didn't change their minds, but it showed everyone else what the evidence actually was. So again, I think it's just being mindful of the platforms and not expecting it to be a neutral zone where anyone can engage in sort of a neutral public sphere, and treat it like a place where they sell advertisements and disinformation at you. But I'm also a little more critical of platforms in general.
It's really helpful. It's hard because we have For some of us, knowing just the adoption of digital channels and meeting folks where they're at is a thing, but also they can be a little bit of a bad time. And we're also living in a world where we have, Bezos saying that the op-ed strategy is changing to only cover the free market and personal liberty. It's just we're in a really difficult time. So I just want to name that, and there is no panacea. But yeah, anyway, we are 10 past. I just want to thank Phil and Abbie again for your amazing expertise and insights. And we will be following up everybody with an email with materials and our guide and a little blog for folks to read. And if there's anything else, Abbie and Phil, that you want to share, if not, I can let everyone bounce.
Thanks, everybody, especially the troopers who stayed long.
Right.
Thanks for all the water work. I love water. Water's great.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.